Welcome to Bitcoin Fixes This, where we explore the impact that Bitcoin will have in all aspects of society. Today's guests are Max Keiser and Stacy Herbert, hosts and producer of Keiser Report. In this episode, we talk about El Salvador, the volcano bomb, and the future of U.S. monetary hegemony. We also talk about their role in the whole thing, their impressions of the country, and how other countries may adopt Bitcoin. Max and Stacy, we are in El Zante. How are you?
I'm feeling at home. I feel home.
Yeah, it's great, Jimmy. You know, this is Bitcoin Beach, and you can feel the energy, the waves, the volcanoes, the people. You can feel it.
You can feel the energy. Yeah, you definitely can, but it's so relaxing. You know, like it's like a relaxing energy.
I see that as being the biggest risk in being here, is that you just basically get to a point where you don't want to work anymore. It's just too relaxing. You're just, man, I'm just going to go into the water, and that's it for today.
Yeah, and certainly there's a lot of people doing that where they just, surf and, eat and then surf. Maybe sleep in there somewhere,
It's a lifestyle. And yeah, it's surfing. Of course, there's a big surfing community, and a lot of surfers come from all over the world because it's one of the top-ranked surfing spots in the world.
It really is, and you can feel it in the water, can't you?
Surfers have been coming here for a very long time, and I'm sure they're not happy with Max and Stacy for bringing down several thousand Bitcoiners here because they're like, hey, all of our surf spots are clogged up with people like Max Keiser trying to learn how to surf.
I don't think that's necessarily true. It hasn't gotten that bad yet.
No.
But this place will get more popular for sure over the next few years. The president and his team are going at full gallop all across his administration, making Bitcoin inroads into every aspect of life here. And, curiously, Jimmy, I saw that the president was in Turkey speaking with the president of Turkey. I wonder if he's trying to orange pill the president of Turkey. Wouldn't that be interesting?
That would be interesting. You wonder if there's like a fraternity of presidents that just sort of like do that, like orange pill each other.
There could be. So, Turkey has undergone a dramatic financial and monetary upheaval. You see that their currency collapsed and then it rallied, and the volatility is enormous. And, of course, we say Bitcoin fixes this. So it might be something. I mean, that would be really incredible. I think Bukele is as good a salesman when it comes to Bitcoin as Michael Saylor is.
I feel like you were right, Max, with Turkmenistan back in 2014, that it'll be the smaller and nimbler countries. Turkey's a big country, and I think it's a hindrance if you were gold bugs, because it's a gold bug nation. So I think it takes them more to overcome to understand Bitcoin as a store of value.
That might make sense. Yeah. Well, so let's talk about why you guys are here. Because you've been here quite a while, if I'm not mistaken, and you plan to be here for a little bit. What's going on? What brought you here?
Well, I really have no free will in this situation, I have to say. I ask myself that too, and I find this absolutely brilliant that I'm here, and I can't stop myself. It's like the game theory of this situation, this moment of hyper-Bitcoinization in El Salvador is Nayib Bukele placed us all in a situation where if you're a Bitcoiner, you want them to succeed, you want him to succeed, you want the country to succeed, you want the volcano bomb to succeed, you want everything about here to succeed, and you're driven here. You need to come here, and we've encountered lots of people having that same sort of thing from Guatemala, from Mexico, from Europe, everybody coming here because feeling the need to make this work, make this a success. Before it happened to me, I was like, oh, this is going to be like Renaissance 2.0. It's going to be like a modern day Florence and Bukele's Medici. And then, because I'm always fascinated by Renaissance Florence, like how did all those people end up in one spot like that? Like how... It seems impossible. It seems statistically impossible that so much greatness can be in just one small spot in one specific time in history. And that's right now here in El Salvador, I feel like I have no choice but to be here. Like, I am 100% committed to making this succeed.
Well, we can be here. So when we heard that the country was making Bitcoin legal tender, we quickly decided to move there, to go there, to be a part of it, because this is the bleeding edge, this is the cutting edge of Bitcoin. What's happening right here in El Salvador? I think we're entering into the era of El Salvador and Bitcoin. I've been in for about 2 years now, the Michael Saylor era, which was when he came out and announced his $400 million purchase on MicroStrategy's balance sheet, and I think now we're entering into the Bukele era. He's over there in Turkey talking to world leaders. He's got a few more stops on his itinerary, and he's going to be orange pilling these world leaders and talking to them about why it makes sense for them to become hyper Bitcoinized. So that's the era that we're in now. So we wanted to be a part of it, and so we got here, and it's a very charming place to be. The hype surrounding it was wrong, as it so often is. It's just a very pleasant place. The weather is incredible. The people are great. There's a lot of entrepreneurial spirit. The Bitcoiners are flocking here. So it's becoming really a great situation.
Well, I think you guys are a little more than involved. I mean, like, Max, you're the one that gave Bukele the idea of a volcano bond, and he seems to have executed on it. Did that surprise you at all? What's the deal?
Well, the Bitcoin-backed bond was first developed in 2014 by myself and Simon Dixon over at Bank to the Future. And he sold some over there on his platform. And then you have at Blockstream, they developed the Bitcoin note, which is a Bitcoin-backed note. It's an interest-paying instrument. And the story is that when the IMF tweeted that they were not happy with El Salvador's getting involved in Bitcoin, I said, hey, you can sell volcano bonds, bonds backed by this volcano energy, the mining rigs, and you can get rid of the IMF. And so that kind of articulated an idea that was floating about. And of course, my background is in finance and securities, so it makes sense that I would, think of these in those terms. I've always thought of Bitcoin as an asset class, going back to when we first got into it, because that's my training, that's my background. So the question always was, is it a stock, is it a bond, is it a commodity, is it a security, is it what is it? And so when the news came out that they were going to make Bitcoin legal tender, I immediately DM'd Simon Dixon, and we were just overflowing with joy, because we had been speculating for 10 years what country would do this, going back really 10 years. And so there it is. So El Salvador pulled the trigger, and I think it's going to start a huge wave.
Well, so they have this volcano bond. You guys have been meeting with all kinds of people, if I'm not mistaken. You met some pretty prominent officials this morning that you tweeted about. The vice president.
Yes, the vice president.
The highest ranking person that's currently in El Salvador met with you guys. So, I mean, what's that been like? Because in a sense, like, they're actually listening to you, right? Like, because you're the experts on this stuff, and you're meeting with a lot of ministers, officials. What's that like? So
you also attended some meetings with us. We invited you to speak to the majority leader here in Congress, and you say they're totally receptive, open, the opposite of the mindset of dictators or authoritarians. They're open to hearing ideas. Everybody you encounter is young and enthusiastic and optimistic, and they have so much hope for the future. And they, like the game, going back to the game theory, is they all need to make this work, and they all want it to work. And they are really interested in being the best. They don't want to be half-assed, right? They don't want to, sorry to swear, but they don't want to be like, they want to do this right. They want to be the quality of Bitcoin. They don't want to be like one of these 7,000 or 8,000 or 9,000 imitators, like kind of like that. They want to get it right. And I think when Bukele announced the volcano bond, when he also announced Bitcoin City at the same time, he was talking about Alexandria and this as, I think he sees El Salvador as like a city-state, like that old model of Florence, like a city-state. And I think that's a clever way to treat a tiny country. You have only 6 million, 7 million people here. The mindset to have is more nimble, right? And more like a mayor rather than, you're not going to, your neighbor is the United States with 350 million people on the world's biggest military and the US dollar, which could, of course, crush anybody. So you've got to think nimble, you've got to be nimble, but you've got to be great, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I feel is that he's surrounded himself, again, a guy who surrounds himself with good people. You have to be a strong person to do that, right? Because you don't want to be somebody else to outshine you. But he has all sorts of people, women, men, who could, are the best and brightest of anywhere in the world that you go and meet, let alone a small country like El Salvador. They're just like amazing people, is what I've encountered. What do you feel, Max?
Well, I get the sense that he's delegated a lot of responsibility to his team, and he's given them some degree of autonomy and a green light to just go and bring their best game, bring their A game, and he's a really good leader. And the team that he's put together is responding. And with Bitcoin at the core and as the foundation, we know that the possibilities are really quite remarkable.
Think about his instincts, his political instincts. Like, where did this come from? Like, where any well-known person who gets, say, Joe Rogan mentions, hey, what about Bitcoin? He has an avalanche of shitcoin promoters in his tweet stream responding to him. Somebody like Bukele, the leader of a nation, they get hit with all the billionaire shitcoin promoters, right? The top guys who say, hey, I'm worth 20 billion, 30 billion, 40 billion, and then I can help you out. And yet somehow he resisted it and stayed with Bitcoin, which is the only one that's money. Like, I think he has a very, very long game here, and I think he knows exactly what he's doing. It's been interesting to observe that there are some who doubt it, but I just think, like, you could see the choices he's made, where a lot of other people, strong, successful, in their own industries, other people, like Elon Musk, fall down, like they fall short. And Bukele didn't at the right time, and that's interesting to me.
Well, tell me about some of the stuff that happened. I think there were what promoters came here and what happened to them.
I'm not sure if I could say which promoters, but you can, the billionaire ones who say are in the top 10 of the crypto coins, and they did all the stuff that they always do, throw around some money and try to be the one, use our coin instead. And I think my instinct is that this administration understands that those coins would make those promoters very wealthy, wealthier than they already are, and that Bitcoin makes their own population wealthy in very more than just like, financial wealth, but in sovereignty, in time, and, having control over their own future and destiny in a way that hasn't happened here. And you could see that, for a fact that hasn't happened here. You don't even need to know anything about El Salvador other than the fact that 3 million Salvadorans live in America. Like, that is...
And what's the population here?
It's under 7 million. It's about 7 million. Between 6 and 7.
Significant amount that are abroad, yeah.
Yeah. And that was where everybody wanted to go. And why? Like, what do you get when okay, obviously some people are going to climb the ladder there. That is... America is has had up until I say recently an American dream where you can climb the ladder. But for the most part, a lot of people are just going for low wage jobs up there, where I think Bitcoin's going to bring higher wage jobs here and just less fiat jobs, like less meaningless, pointless, dead end sort of jobs at the end of, at these late stage of neoliberalism that we have. It's just like a hollowed out economy that we have in America as well. Like, it's not, I think it's a new dawn here.
Yeah, I think you have to also, I don't know if this for sure, But I think Safdine Amusa's book, The Bitcoin Standard, I think that was circulated here and it was read. And that does a fantastic job in laying out the case for Bitcoin and how it would impact a country like El Salvador. I see the politician up in Canada is sounding a lot like he's been studying the Bitcoin standard rigorously.
I think he admitted it on Twitter, actually.
Yeah.
He said, thank you, Safety, for your books.
Right. So that book is having a remarkable influence on politicians and countries around the world. And it lays out a great case. And so people are realizing that this is something that is a way out from the fiat money nightmare.
Well, let's talk about the situation El Salvador was in before, because, like you see a lot of poverty, and it's like there's a tendency for us to, I think, blame the locals, like blame the people, and say, oh, maybe they're lazy or something like that, when in fact there's some other factors that come in, especially at the international monetary level, aren't there?
I think the Salvadoran economy since the era of colonialism. I know, part of the thing about talking about colonialism is that it kind of got hijacked by all those communists and the socialists who, have kind of embarrassing slogans and all that stuff. But the thing is, so when the Spanish settled here, they took all the land from the native population who were living here. Okay, perhaps they didn't have legal courts and contracts and documents showing that they own the land, but certainly I think it's quite obvious they lived here for several thousand years on the land. So, ownership is 9/10 of the law, right? Like your possession is like they're there, right? So it's always been in this country an extreme disparity between the ownership of the property. And so what happened is along comes like the struggle between that labor and capital and all that Marx sort of stuff is in the 1920s when you had the 14 families that owned everything here, and the native population owned nothing. They had to work the land for the 14 families that owned everything. And so the economy was geared towards export purely, nothing for a domestic population. There was no development of thinking of an investment in the local economy. It was all towards sending, cacao and coffee and sugars, things like that, commodities, raw commodities out. So when there was a giant crisis in the 1920s that caused the commodity prices to collapse, what the 14 families here did was they started to seize more land, even more land that they could find from the indigenous population, and force them to produce even more coffee and stuff like that, to export more to make up for the lower price. That resulted in the first of basically the U.S. really getting involved here. So they had what's called the La Matanza, which is the massacre, and the 14 families just massacred 30,000 natives. The indigenous population just massacred them and chased them down, and like they all dispersed and hid. Like nobody wanted to be indigenous. It was a danger. But that brought in that sort of action actually brought in the U.S. corporations, because this was like they wanted a population that was controlled like this, and they wanted a population that could be just slaughtered essentially if they tried to organize, if they caused unrest in any way. And it was just for export. So they wanted to export everything back to the U.S. market, but build it here with forced labor or docile labor that could be, controlled. Cut to then the Civil War, which, Max and I, of course, remember because we were teenagers or older, during the 80s under Reagan. And you had a similar situation there where it was, financial crisis of the 1970s. The oil embargo, prices, stagflation, everything was a crisis back then. And we're starting to enter a similar sort of data and numbers right now. So this is something that Max and I have already experienced as children. But what happened here was, again, the unrest, the extreme poverty, people start to rise up. You see that every time we have a financial crisis. You saw it after 2008. You see it. You're starting to see it now after COVID and the lockdowns and all the money printing. You're starting to see unrest start around the world. But what happened here is you also had the Cold War going on. So you had the U.S. versus the Soviets. So the U.S. became like obsessed that the Soviets would take over here. And so anybody who was not one of the 14 families was a potential to be a commie, you know. So their whole notion was just like, let's just slaughter all the communists, the potential communists, their base. And that's what you saw, a very, very vicious civil war here. And the U.S. played a very, very prominent role. We could go into some of the details about like the assassination of the Archbishop, the El Mozote, which was an assassination, the slaughter, yet another slaughter. It's marked by slaughters every few decades here, you know, from big international powers like the U.S. of El Mozote was the slaughter of like 1,100 people, mostly women and children, who were slaughtered, and they just had the 40th anniversary, the remembrance of that just recently. But this is the situation of the sort of, you know, think of what your mentality is. Like every state in the U.S. has their own unique culture and mentality based on the history and the weather and the economy of that location. But here you have the same repeated slaughters, whether it's La Matanza or El Mozote, and nothing gets done. There's no international tribunal. There's no repercussions for who the people who do this to the population, and that must instill some sort of sense that there's no recourse, that these people, there's a certain class of people that could just slaughter you if you want too much, if you need title to your land, if you need a bank account, if you try to demand any of these things. There's a sort of sense that could happen up until now.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting history of what's happened, right? Like, it's a population that's been subjected to a lot of conquest, a lot of physical conquest, but that didn't really end with just the mere independence. It kind of continued in a monetary fashion.
Yes. Well, so the IMF, of course. So after the Civil War ended in 92, you had the two parties. Like most Western democracies, we all have these two parties that seem to go back and forth, and they maintain a status quo of a hopelessness, really, for most people, except for themselves. They're the cantillionaire class. They get all the government contracts. They build all the stuff. They get all the benefits, and they might trickle down some occasionally to somebody else. But yeah, so they've had to repeat how much of their GDP is 100% debt to GDP with IMF sort of loans and stuff like this. And you know what the IMF does. Everybody knows now. And again, it's like, a lot of left-wing activists have kind of made kooky statements and make it cringe sometimes. But the fact is, like, they do force you. As Bukele said when he was running for mayor the first time in 2012, he mentions the IMF, and he mentions that the fact that they force you not to invest in your own economy and your own people, that you have to cut investment in education. You have to cut investment in infrastructure. You have to cut investment in security. So what happens? Well, look at all the violence that happened here. Look at all the danger. Look at all the lack of education. That's why people flee to America. So that's the most important of all resources that were extracted from El Salvador over the past 40 years is the human capital, the humans that left this place. And it creates a sense of no hope and no future here, that the future is elsewhere. So why build here? And I think if you read Bukele's early writing, what he said in interviews, what he said in debates back in 2012, 2013, 2014, you see he talks about that needing to build, encourage, and offer hope in a way that people, the locals, the people born and raised here want to stay here and want to build here and want to live here and build their future here, not in America.
Yeah, the two-party system just grinding on over and over again. So Bukele, when he started out as mayor, he created this third way or third party. and it was very successful, and he won, and he's just been riding that right up to the presidency, and that's worked for him. That's been a successful formula.
Yeah, well, so talk a little bit more about the IMF, right? Like, how do they take over, and how does it sort of like, how do they take the resources of a country? Because that seems to be sort of like a recurring theme, especially in Central and South America and Africa and many other places where they'll come in, offer these loans, and then when they can't pay it back, they kind of take this stuff and then start imposing austerity and all this other stuff. It just, they call it austerity, but it's really just kind of taking their stuff, right? Like,
yes, exactly.
What's going on? Well, how does this all work? Why is this like mafioso kind of behavior allowed?
Well, you've articulated it very well, right? So they make loans to these countries, and they get the leadership to be somewhat corrupt in accepting all these huge loans. And then when the loans can't be paid back, they start extracting wealth. And as we know from John Perkins' book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, then the repercussions are they send in the hitman. They literally assassinate government leaders. And it is a mafia model in that sense. It's a loan sharking model or a mafia model. And the IMF is a key element in all of that. And the reason it goes on is that it's highly profitable. So in America, if you can sell something as being highly profitable, people will embrace it. Because that idea of profit, making money, is America's driving force, if you will. So that's why it's profitable. The mafia is profitable. The IMF is profitable with that mafia model. And Bitcoin is a way out of it. So that's why they're not happy about it, because they're going to shut down their pipeline of money.
These are also systems that have kind of developed over hundreds of years. And think of like the British Empire, how they ruled and how they operated, kind of like a Raj system. You find one guy in India and you pay him a lot of money, you give him a lot of wealth, you give him a lot of power and prestige, and he controls the locals for you. So the IMF just needs to find one person who, through all the various institutions and powerful people, can make sure that person rules and say, here, you collect $100 million and give us the rest, all the resources of the country, and just point to the contract. We have a contract. Our whole system is based around contract law. So that's how, you could paint the peasants here in El Salvador in the 1920s and 30s as communists, because these commies want to redistribute this land. And you're like, well, no, they want their land back. Okay, technically they didn't have a contract, but that's how it's presented, the propaganda to the world. It's like, no, I'm Lord Snooty Puss, and I have the contract. I have the title to this land. And this peasant wants it redistributed. They want, so they call them like Marxists and say that when in fact it was the guy's land in the first place. And they do the same thing with these contracts. It's like, well, this guy signed the contract and they owe us their resources and it's fair deal, right? They signed the contract, so they owe us this stuff.
Well, so it seems like the IMF has been using these loans as a way to sort of like trade printed dollars.
Yes.
For real resources.
Yes.
Right? Like, and it's this, and it gets the world more on a dollar standard. And it seems like they're starting to this is one of the few places where they're able to roll that back. So talk to me about, the role that Bitcoin is playing in that sort of like de-dollarization or the de-monetary imperial, economic independence.
Well, volcano bonds, it's $1 billion deal and can scale up to a $20 billion deal. So they can pay down all their external debt. They can be a debt-free country on volcano bonds. And so that's a very appealing position for them to be in. And I think that's a goal that they want to achieve. And so the IMF would not be sniffing around because they can't make money lending at less than 1/2%. They're going to have to go force and go somewhere else and take their bag of tricks somewhere else. Go back to Haiti. Go back to some of these other countries where they're continuously plundering.
The plunder model.
Well, we were talking about Haiti earlier, and like that history and how much they've been plundered is something I don't think that we really learned. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I'm not an expert on it, but I do know. So I do know that El Salvador has mentioned it. The various ministers here have said it and tweeted about it, and they don't want to be Haiti. So what Haiti is sure, of course, they're one of the first, if not the first nation that was enslaved. They had slaves there, and France was the monarchy. They got their freedom before the American slave people, the enslaved people there. So France, however, they had to pay up until just a few decades ago. They had to continue paying France for losing their property, which is them. They were the property. And like I was just saying, like, well, we have a contract and we own you, and therefore your ancestor, your descendants will have to continue paying us for our lost property. And it's like absurd, right? But they're in a situation where what you see today. And I mean, obviously it doesn't take much to realize that we sent in the Marines, literally, we've sent in the Marines under Clinton and, deposed flew their leader out of the country, decided we don't like him. We're going to take him out. We're going to take him away. Like, how is that even allowed? Like, it just seems bizarre, right? But they don't want to be like that here, because what Haiti is now is it's part of that cantillionaire class in America, like the Clinton Foundation, okay? They have earned money operating, cleansing their own reputation by doing good work in Haiti, when very little of it ever shows up on the ground. Your friend was talking about, just from news stories, being there in Haiti, and you see, like, people that were the victims of a natural disaster, say, a decade ago, they're still living in the tents, like in refugee camps all these years later. That's all they got from the Clinton Foundation sort of people, a tent. And that's all they have. There's nothing was provided to help invest in the people and rebuild and let them have their actual independence. Everything is like some sort of scam, like these shit coins that come here. That's ultimately what they want, is like you to get, okay, we're going to give you a tent. Look how great we are. We look amazing. And they take a photo of like, look, I donated this tent, but you're never going to be sovereign. You're never going to be independent. We're going to make sure, in fact, that you never have the capital to ever build your own economy here, a real economy.
Well, Haiti, to me, is just sort of like the way that things go if you sort of like let the IMF and, other countries sort of determine your destiny. But they seem to have taken their destiny and said, we're going to take this and we're going to run with it. So what are some of the things that they're doing here? I know you've met with a lot of government leaders. What are some programs that they're doing?
By the way, I do want to point out one thing about this IMF sort of model and how the U.S. uses it to... They have their own unique innovation in empire building, how they've done it. It's through this debt and contracts. They skipped the Brits did that, but the Brits built railways and infrastructure. The U.S. doesn't do that, right? They take, and that's it. But notice how the U.S. Is vocally saying, like, accusing China of economic imperialism for doing the exact same thing. And you're like, wait.
In Africa,
yeah. You're like, wait, isn't it the same exact thing? Whatever. But, well, here, they're building Bitcoin City. They're, like we said at the top, they're very, very nimble, and they're working fast to devise the legislation to go around, to create this city-state, to create the Alexandria model, to bring in the best and brightest from around the world. And they're spending a lot of time in our interactions with them in terms of how to educate the population and how to prepare the population, how to bring best practices here, how to not fall into the same sort of trap of, say, like Panama. Like, who wants to be Panama, right? Like with sleazy, kind of dodgy offshore companies and who knows what's going on there. And they want to have, that's just like another sort of global Cantillon or oligarchy class. Like, you want people who are going to build here, that want to be here, that want to build here, that want to do stuff here and make this a place to live and a huge success story for Bitcoin. So I think my perception is that the media and many people have the whole story wrong. The people who are negative about it, I think they don't get it, because if you're here, you don't get infected. You're here. If you come here, you get infected with the optimism. You can't not see it. Like, unless you have some sort of derangement syndrome where you just like refuse to see the positive, it's hard to miss.
Yeah, I think one of the benefits of having a Bitcoin economy is that it cuts away a lot of bureaucracy. So smaller enterprises can scale. And with this, put a lot of hard work, and you can go from 1 pupusa stand to 5 or 10 pupusa stand. And because you're building on Bitcoin and it's sound money and it's great money, it's perfect money, you don't have the need to go down to the local bureaucrat and spend time filling out forms and doing all kinds of other stuff. Because you've got great equity. You can just go to the bank and say, I've got fantastic equity, give me $10,000. They're like, okay, cool, because you've got Bitcoin. It's not like, because all in the fiat world, the value is managed by charade. And so there's a huge bureaucracy to keep that charade going, to keep the puppet show going. It's enormously complicated Rube Goldberg machine to make it look like fiat money has value. And that's the bureaucracy of it. And so small business people end up, having trouble scaling. So I think here you're going to see a lot of entrepreneurialism. A lot of small businesses get bigger. The government's got the pet hospital, which they attribute to Bitcoin. They built a library down in the San Salvador city center. They're going to revitalize that whole area, which is interesting. Bukele was during his time as mayor of San Salvador, did a huge job in revitalizing that. And that's a project that will continue. Bitcoin City is a big, big project. It borders a couple of other countries in the region. I think that'll get the word about Bitcoin, and we're going to see some spillover impact on those countries as well. And so it's an idea, it's an acorn that grows into big, big things. As you know, it started out with the Genesis block. Here we are, where we are today, and we're just at the beginning.
I think it's also interesting how necessity and need has driven a lot of this adoption here. You see it also with Nigeria, like any of these countries that are highly entrepreneurial, and yet, especially during COVID or any of the crises where liquidity of dollars dries up globally, they can't trade, right? So what happened in Nigeria during COVID is all the guys who import used cars from Japan, they couldn't get any dollars. So they had to turn to Bitcoin. Now, that's almost a hyper-Bitcoinized economy in Nigeria because of that. Here, I was talking to a local shopkeeper, and she pointed out that they first started hearing about Bitcoin, the mention of it was from Europeans. Because they would come here and the shop would only accept cash. And cash here was dollars. And the Europeans would have euros, but no US dollars. And the nearest ATM was a bus ride away to El Tunco, the next town over. So then they would hear, well, how about Bitcoin? Do you take Bitcoin? And they were like, what? Bitcoin? And so that became, Bitcoin's becoming the universal currency. That's money, right? That's that tier 1, layer 1. That's universal. Like, if it's the common currency, it's a common money, it's everybody can think in it. And at least with the shop I was talking to, that's how she started to first hear about Bitcoin and accept Bitcoin.
Well, so there's a perception here that's very obvious, right? Like you were saying, it's very optimistic. A lot of people are excited. There's a lot of investment. But, I don't think the IMF's giving up that easily. There seems to be these stories that seem to be trickling out about, how evil Bukele is. I think there's a perception that he's a dictator, that all the, and I see these threads almost like every week. It's almost as if, there's a concerted effort to make him look back. They 3 years ago, like nobody cared, other than okay, it's Murdo capital of the world or something like that, and that was it. Now it's like they're almost digging. I don't know. It feels like they're, or the stories are spun in a way as to make Bukele specifically and his party more generally look very bad. What do you think about that? Is that a concerted attack, or is it like just honest reporting? What's the deal?
Well, Bitcoin has had this the whole since 2011. We've heard so much FUD and so much like it was for drug dealers, it was for money launderers, it's for tax evaders, it's for hackers, it's for every bad person out there, right? We've heard that over and over since the beginning. So yet nobody likes, no empire, no the masters of the universe, the people who are benefit from the current status quo, they don't like somebody to have to show them up by actually doing and succeeding. You could, again, like I don't follow any of the particulars of like the party politics and partisanship and stuff like that. All you need to do is look at the numbers, run the numbers, look at how many people left El Salvador over the previous 30, 40 years. Millions. That tells you everything you need to know. Look at America. 100,000 people overdosed last year. The number one cause of death for 18 to 45-year-olds is overdose. Number 2 is suicide. That tells you a lot, that whatever the statistics are, whatever the news says, the numbers show you that something's not right there. People are coming back. People are moving from around the world. You've probably received, because you're here, you're probably receiving messages like, what's it like? Oh my God, I'm thinking of coming. Should I come? And we get that nonstop. So that's what they don't want. They don't want a good example. They don't want an alternative. They want only their model as the option because they're lazy and they don't want to compete.
Right. And trust in U.S. media, I believe, is at an all-time low. I think that less than 15% of Americans trust the media, right? I mean, it's different than in Walter Cronkite days where maybe 80% of the people trusted the evening news. So the news media business in the U.S. and around the world is entirely untrusted. And America's run out of good propagandists, I would say.
Yeah.
The propaganda is an art that requires some skill. And I don't know where the good propagandists are in America, but they're not working for CNN or MSNBC or Washington Post or the New York Times. Like Paul Krugman is a propagandist. He's been shown to be a propagandist. He says blatantly retarded things, if I may use that phrase, without getting too much trouble. But he says blatantly, obnoxiously ill-informed things that are in the service of his masters, of the elite, the banking elite. I mean, he just says insane things. So, and when you have alternative and alt media like Joe Rogan and others, where they are trouncing CNN. I think Joe Rogan's audience is 20 times CNN, right? So when you see stuff about Bukele from American propagandists, it's just another meme, right? It's just like it's here for a second and it's gone. It's a meme. It doesn't mean anything. The numbers don't support it. Bitcoin is exposing all of the charlatans and these folks. And I think Bukele laughs. He's tweeting and just mocking these people. He told Moody's to go fuck themselves. He tells the IMF to go pound sand, which is the correct. This is the correct. You can't give them any respect because they don't deserve any respect. They're the lowest level mafia, leg breaking scumbags. The IMF, the Washington Post, the New York Times. They've got no moral censor whatsoever. No credibility. Nobody believes them.
I also I know we live in a day and age where the meaning of words have pretty much reversed of what they used to mean. And you know what I mean, right? Yeah. And so when people say dictator, I'm like, the guy was just elected. He created a new party to run for president and he swept the Congress, everything. He was elected, right?
Democratically elected, yeah.
Yeah, and the people, if you've ever been to a dictatorship, like when we were in Cairo, and you're there under Mubarak, try to ask somebody, what do you think? Do you think Mubarak's a jerk? Or anything? Do you think he's fat? like, they're not going to say, nobody's going to tell you the truth, right? Nobody's going to say any opinion about Mubarak because he's a dictator and he'll have you killed, right? Like, so it's a word that has no meaning anymore. I don't know what it means. I don't know what it means when they say that.
So I think of America in the 50s under Eisenhower. I'm sure a lot of people in different countries said he's a dictator. You know, he built the highway system and he warned against the industrial military complex. And insecure people say stupid shit. So there's nothing that backs it up. And
by the way, these people are also tearing down statues of like Thomas Jefferson. You know, like he gave you the freaking Constitution to the United States of America before the white paper. That was like one of the most amazing documents ever written in human history. So like these people are like, they've lost their minds, right?
Yeah, it's strange because like, you know, we were talking earlier about like you guys being on the front page of the opposition newspaper.
Yeah.
The fact that they have an opposition newspaper tells you that it's not a dictatorship. Yeah. You know, like people are like, oh, but he changed the Constitution so he could run again. Yeah, he did it legally. You know, this is the constitutional amendment process. It's like as if that's, I don't know, like improper or against the rules of democracy or something. I don't really get it.
If you say, oh, Joe Biden is a senile, somebody with cognitive problems who should be in an assisted living facility, whose policies are incredibly dangerous for Americans. He's a dictator via senility. That's a topic that should be explored. That's an interesting topic. But you don't see anybody talking about that in the U.S., where they should be concerned about their own problems. Right? Why are they even concerned about this country? Because of the IMF and the extraction model that gives Americans a comfy lifestyle by stealing other people's resources. So they feel like they've got to stick their nose into these other countries' business.
Also, like, I'm not sure why the Constitution, and I'm assuming it has something to do with the United States and a lot of this region. They only allow one-term president, which kind of seems like you're a lame duck as soon as you get in. So I'm not sure. Which maybe like that's a good thing if it's a politician. But if you happen to encounter a leader and you know you want them to have more than one lame duck session, right? And I'm not even sure, like, why it's the rules of the game are very fluid, right? So Merkel, she was the chancellor of Germany for 17 years. The people would have reelected her if she could have run if she wanted, but she decided to retire just a few months ago. So like, why is she not a dictator? I don't understand like the rules of like why she's not a dictator, even though she had a wide support. People loved her, and people love Bukele. Like, maybe, who knows? I don't know if he's going to run again. But
so attached to this sobriquet of dictator, usually the next thing that comes out has to do with human rights abuses. Okay. The U.S. has the largest prison population in the world. The U.S., as Stacy mentioned, 100,000 OxyContin overdoses, another 100,000 suicide deaths, biggest cause of death. You've got systemic apartheid going on with the black community being imprisoned to supply cheap labor. Slave labor has been made legal again in America. Okay, those are human rights issues. So the person in charge is a dictator. Okay, versus, let's say, El Salvador, they're giving people individual sovereignty and freedom with Bitcoin. This entrepreneurial GDP is being boosted. There's huge community sense. People are coming here. Tourism is booming. Perception is changing. That's a freedom fighter. That's a freedom fighter. That's a freedom fighter.
That's a good point, because what sort of dictator gives a tool for individual sovereignty to their people? Like, that's the last thing you want them to have, right? You don't want them to know about how to have unconfiscatable wealth and individual sovereignty. So why would you do that? They always said the same thing about Putin too. You're like, what sort of, and I would ask, like, what sort of dictator pays down all that debt? He paid off the IMF debt. Remember that? And then he built up, they have like $700 billion in reserves and gold and other instruments. Like, dictators don't build a huge pile of national wealth for the people. Like, that's the exact opposite of what they do. They plunder the nation.
Right.
They turn
Meanwhile,
it into
in San Francisco, the big tech companies obviously scam the San Francisco out of all the money they need to stop people from pooping in the streets, dying from overdoses in the streets, and living like, Calcutta in the 1970s. That's dictators.
That's a good point because, a lot of this, like the charges of dictator, obviously, people should always be nonstop, challenging authority and challenging the boss, the guy setting the rules. That's one thing. But when it's people like the San Francisco sorts, the Silicon Valley sorts leading the charge, it's like, in terms of human rights disasters, look at San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
Look at
Australia.
Look at those situations and maybe look at yourself and try to fix yourself. And it also matters, by the way, is momentum and trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
So the U.S. was like an amazing place, right? It is an amazing place. It's founded on amazing documents by amazing people, amazingly flawed people. Yes, like if you look back on history and the things that were accepted at the time are no longer accepted. But when it's going down, and you see that with the despair, those deaths of despair, as we've already commented, here it's the opposite. They've hit bottom. El Salvador's hit bottom. They had peak murder rate, homicide, bleak situation, millions fleeing, and now it's the tide is turning. So I think that when the tide turns, there's no stopping that force of it coming in, right? There's nothing they could say. They could call them all sorts of names, but sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, right?
I can guarantee anyone using the word dictator is either a shitcoiner or a no-coiner.
Mm. Well, I mean, there are people that are calling that even within the Bitcoin community, but
do they even understand Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Because, I've tussled with a few people in the Bitcoin community, and they lack faith in Bitcoin.
Mm.
They feel like...
No. I'm with Jimmy, and I understand. I know who he's talking about, and there are genuine, hardcore, really good Bitcoiners who have said that, but I think, they
seem to be falling for propaganda in a way. Because, like, that journalist, like, a spyware story, right?
Yeah.
That, to me, is, like, focusing on the one wart on, like, somebody's face instead of, like, the rest of who they are or something like that. Like, everybody has warts, right? Like, and they're like, okay, well, this is evidence that the entire person is completely...
Right, and that story was sourced from a group of, like, 15 different entities that are all think tanks in Washington, D.C. Yeah. So it's propaganda.
Yeah.
Well, but also, like, the average American commits 4 felonies a day.
Yeah.
For a reason. That they control you. That's a great, just like what I said, that, we have this contract that we have the title to this land, not you, indigenous population that has lived here for thousands of years. Well, they do the same thing. It's like, well, Stacy, you know what? You're starting to make trouble. You know what? We have all these felonies, the 4 felonies a day you've been committing for the last 20 years. Well, here's what you did. And the same thing with this, like this software, like almost all, like as Edward Snowden revealed, and also Julian Assange when he released the Vault 7 stuff, like they're the ones that created all these back doors. You're a tech guy, a coder, and like what they want to introduce onto these. They're the ones that created these back doors. They could install anything on anybody's computer, all journalists across the world, and whoever, if they decide they don't like that leader, look what we found. We don't know who put it there. It must have been the guy we don't like.
The CIA was found to hack Angela Merkel's phone.
Mm. Yeah, it feels like almost in the name of balance, like people want to believe some bad things or something like that. Yeah. And instead, it's like, instead of focusing on all the good things that are happening and all the interesting, like, we went to visit like the houses that they're building with like this innovative like Bitcoin mortgage payment thing. Like, that's really cool, right? Like, and that sort of innovation isn't happening in the U.S. It's happening here in El Salvador. That's amazing.
Yes.
But instead of focusing on that stuff, it's like these kind of random, like, almost unrelated warts as if they're relevant to the work of what's happening.
Well, look, if you're a human rights person, you're going to find human rights violations. If you're a left-wing social justice warrior, you're going to find LGBTQT violations. If you're, you come to Bitcoin who you are, and that's it. And you can't see it in any other lens but who you are. So that would be more interesting if somebody who is not related to those industries just, had an opinion that was a contrast to what they would be normally doing, then you'd say, well, that's interesting because they're normally, in that other industry, and they're looking at it from their industry. This is what we're finding in the medical, what's going on with the pandemic. But when you just have people just espousing the talking points of their industry, they're just looking for stuff to talk about because that's what they do. That's their job.
Also, by the way, I don't think journalists are, even though we're journalists, I don't think they have more rights above any other citizens, right?
Yeah.
I think all people should assume that any communications they're having digitally are intercepted. I do that. I know our communication, when Hillary lost spectacularly in a humiliating fashion and she can't get over it, to Donald Trump, she blamed us. The DNI report blames Keiser Report. They reported on Keiser Report. So I know anytime I send communication, even on so-called encrypted stuff like Signal, I still assume it's actually being read by the CIA or NSA because I don't believe for one moment that they don't have some way of accessing that.
That's why you should use PGP.
Well, I'm not as clever as you are, but I just
the UI on it is horrible. But yeah.
Yeah, but if you can't, that's early Bitcoin. It's that's why we all got wrecked because it's there was no UI and it was just you had to be clever. But, I always just assume that they're reading everything that I'm communicating and be aware of that. So everybody should do that, though, unless you're clever enough to be like Jimmy Song and communicate.
PGP is not that hard, but it is kind of broken. I do feel like there's room for more encrypted messaging that's where you host your own server, so there's no backdoor or something like that.
I think we're going to see more and more of that because I see people talking about that all the time, where you have your own server and you maintain all your own documents and stuff like that. Because how many times do we have to be hacked and our data leaked before that changes?
Sadly, if it's free, not a lot of people will keep doing it. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is sort of the opposition parties here who are doing all of the complaining that are sort of hinting at human rights abuses and things like that. What I find really interesting is that both opposition parties seem to be saying, we really should be going back to the IMF and, doing what they tell us to do instead of all of this stuff that, that our people want.
All these old parties, whether it's here in France, the U.S., it's all the young people. They're over that. They're just over those old ideas. They're over the boomers, the Ponzi scheme they want to keep afloat. Everything you see in the United States and around the world is about keeping the boomers' Ponzi scheme alive. Everything, literally. Max can speak to this. He's a boomer, the very youngest of them, but still, we blame him in our household.
Yes.
Max, is it your fault?
That's true. It all feeds the boomer Ponzi scheme. Everything is for that. And it's falling apart. So the two parties here that are in opposition, they're boomers. And they're very, very weak. It's laughably foolish. They thought that Bitcoin was going to not work in the beginning, and now they're backtracking because it's kind of a big hit. So they have to backtrack on that. And they don't really have any points to make, any valid points to make. And it's very small, and they're just, I think, there for a laugh.
Well, are they sort of aging out? Are they younger people
No, they seem to be all boomers and aging out, and nobody in the millennial or Gen Z that I'm aware of is against what Bukele is doing.
Yeah, he seems to be very popular, and a lot of people are very excited. I mean, we've been seeing a lot of the stuff just sort of on our own, right? Seeing houses being this. There's just stuff going on. It's kind of crazy, and people are being self-sovereign, it seems.
I hope it succeeds. He always says Singapore. He wants us to be like Singapore, and I think they deserve it. I think they've had hundreds of years of bad times imposed upon the people, and I think it's time for good times. I think they deserve it, and I think Bitcoin was a clever end run around the control mechanisms, those mechanisms of control that have succeeded for hundreds of years here. to keep the population from accessing the opportunity and the resources here. I think
that seems like a human rights issue.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, what about the human rights issue? That's a human rights issue of 3 million people. Most of them, by the way, having to cross, like, across Mexico. Dangerous thing. Like, going over...
And this is a very mountainous region, so it's not easy to travel
No.
within El Salvador. Yeah.
No. So, it's not like... I think that's a human rights disaster. I think it's a disaster even worse than San Francisco. Like, you know, like the fact that so many people left this country, I just find that like forced because of the plunder. And who oversaw the plunder? I don't want to get involved in any local politics, but I just feel like who was involved in the plunder? Well, in the U.S., we had the Democrats and the Republicans overseeing it, which is a bit different in the U.S. because you have states, like states have a lot of power and they could create their own unique environment and economy there. Here, it's just like one small nation state. So it's just two parties that plunder. And we've had that in many countries around the world since 1971. And they've all plundered, they're all quintillionaires, and they've all just taken and given nothing back, and they don't build. And that's what fiat incentivizes. It incentivizes destruction. And that's what Bukele said to the UN in 2014, is that we need to start building instead of destroying. Like, this is what humans prefer to do if we give them the opportunity.
So, profound words indeed. Any last thoughts on what you think this place will be like in, say, 5 years?
It'll be busier and busier. I think it's going to be better than Singapore. Singapore, to me, is not like, I like Florence. Like, I feel like it's a deeper richness that could be here. Like, culturally rich, like art and fun things and building things. Like, Singapore is certainly a huge success. And obviously, they've done very well financially. But I think there's even more. I think there's something deeper that's going to happen here.
Right. Well, it's definitely going to be a lot more activity, a lot more going on. And it's going to become a really big hot spot, for sure.
Maybe you guys will be citizens here or something?
I hope so. This is every day we're working towards this.
Yeah, coming soon.
All right. Thanks for joining me, guys.
Thanks for coming down here, Jimmy.
Unchained Capital is a sponsor of this podcast. I'm an advisor to the company. I know the team well, and I'm excited for what they are building. If you need multi-sig, collaborative custody, or a Bitcoin native financial services partner, learn more at unchained.com. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Bitcoin Fixes This. Max can be found at Max Keiser on Twitter, and Stacy can be found at Stacy Herbert on Twitter. Until next time, fiat, the one best.